The morning began peacefully, but a single red cap set off a chain of events that turned everything upside down. It all started with a routine flight from Chicago to San Francisco. Passengers clumsily maneuvered their carry-ons, trying to fit them into the already overcrowded overhead compartments. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced smiles, their greetings delivered in polished, professional tones as if pre-recorded. Among them was Sarah Langley, a resolute and principled woman known among her colleagues for her strict work ethic and clear stance on contentious issues. Sarah never shied away from confrontation if she felt the situation demanded her intervention. The flight began uneventfully until Sarah's attention was drawn to a passenger seated in one of the middle rows. The man, about 40 years old with a neat appearance, sat quietly in economy class. He was unremarkable, except for one thing. He wore a red baseball cap with a phrase that immediately stood out: "Make America Great Again." To Sarah, this cap was more than just an accessory. It seemed like a challenge to her very principles. The man appeared unbothered by her lingering gaze. Adjusting his hat, he leaned back in his seat and opened a magazine. As Sarah continued her duties, distributing drinks before takeoff, her eyes kept returning to the red cap. Finally, she stopped beside him. Holding a tray of drinks, her tone carried a hint of sarcasm. "Interesting choice of accessory," she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man looked up, his expression calm, and responded curtly, "It's just a hat." His composure only fueled her indignation. "Just a hat?" Sarah repeated, feeling her patience wear thin. Later in the galley, she vented her frustration to her colleagues. "Can you believe that guy? Sitting there in that hat like it's no big deal. How does he not see how offensive that is to others?" Her senior colleague Linda tried to calm her down. "It's not our job, Sarah. Just let it go. Focus on the flight." But Sarah was adamant. "We have rules against offensive behavior," she said firmly. With determination, she marched back down the aisle, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Stopping in front of the man, Sarah crossed her arms. "Sir, your hat is making other passengers uncomfortable. You'll need to remove it." The man closed his magazine and looked up at her, his expression steady. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm not taking it off." Her tone turned icy. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances and whispered among themselves. The man stood up silently, gathered his belongings, and exited the plane without a word. Sarah felt triumphant. She had stood by her principles and protected the passengers. But the sense of victory was short-lived. When the flight landed in San Francisco, she was met by Stephen Marlowe, a senior manager at the airline. His stern expression immediately unsettled her. "We need to talk," he said, without so much as a greeting. In a private office, Stephen slammed a stack of papers onto the desk. "Do you know who you just removed from the flight?" he asked coldly. Sarah froze. "Some passenger causing discomfort." Stephen cut her off sharply. "That was Michael Hayward, the owner of this entire airline." Sarah's world crumbled. Stephen's words hit her harder than any physical blow. "You humiliated and kicked your own boss off the plane." He gave her two options: resign or undergo mandatory training on professional ethics and customer service. Sarah chose the training, realizing this was her last chance. As she walked out of the office, she began to understand how her personal convictions had spiraled into a destructive storm, one whose aftermath she would be cleaning up for a long time. Sarah couldn't believe her career could be derailed by such events. She sat in silence at home, replaying every moment of that fateful flight in her mind. Her confidence in being right, her sense of victory, it had all turned to ruin. A few days later, she attended the mandatory training. The room was modest and there were only a handful of participants, each there because of mistakes they'd made on the job. The instructor, a woman in her 50s, introduced herself as Melanie White. She began by explaining the core principles of interacting with passengers. "Our primary mission is safety and comfort, but we can't judge people solely by their appearance or political beliefs." Sarah listened, though she felt her frustration simmering inside. She still believed she had done the right thing by standing up for other passengers. Melanie noticed her tension and asked a direct question. "Sarah, what were you feeling when you confronted that man?" Sarah hesitated before responding. I felt like I had to stand up for my principles. Melanie nodded. Principles are important, but did you consider that your actions might have been perceived as discriminatory? Those words made Sarah pause. She remembered the man's calm demeanor, the measured way he had responded to her. Perhaps he truly hadn't bothered anyone, except her. Over the following weeks, Sarah attended training sessions that simulated difficult scenarios. She learned to find a balance between her personal convictions and her professional duties. Gradually, Sarah began to understand that her actions could indeed have come across as unfair. After completing the program, she was reinstated at work. But returning wasn't easy. Many of her colleagues had heard about her mistake, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Even so, Sarah refused to give up. She worked harder than ever, determined to rebuild her reputation. Slowly but surely, her perseverance and professionalism began to pay off. Months after the incident, Sarah found herself on a flight where she once again saw the man in the red cap. It was none other than Michael Hayward. Her heart raced as she recognized him. She approached him, doing her best to stay composed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayward. Welcome aboard." He looked up, his expression calm, with no trace of anger or resentment. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Langley." Throughout the flight, Sarah made every effort to demonstrate her growth. She offered him coffee, ensured his seat was comfortable, and checked on him often to make sure he felt at ease. When the plane landed, Michael called her over. "Ms. Langley, I can see you've learned a lot since then. Keep it up." His words felt like a kind of forgiveness. Sarah never again allowed her personal emotions to overshadow her professionalism. She had learned that respecting people, regardless of their views, was what made her work truly meaningful. As soon as Claire stepped out of the building, the cold Los Angeles wind stung her face, but it was nothing compared to the storm of emotions churning inside her. She lowered her head as if trying to avoid the stares of passers-by. Yet it felt like the whole world was watching her humiliation. Her colleagues avoided meeting her gaze. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, echoing like a thunderous roar in her mind. Her name was now irrevocably tied to that incident, to that hat and the fallout it had caused. When she got into her car, her hands betrayed her, trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. Jacob's words replayed in her head. There won't be a second chance after this. She knew that every action she took from this point forward would be under intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, the storm continued to rage within the airline's corporate offices. Media headlines had latched onto the incident. Airline ejects passenger over political views. CEO faces discrimination on his own flight. Claire tried to avoid the news, but it found her everywhere. On office screens, on her phone, even in conversations while waiting for her coffee. Her name resurfaced again and again. Her first professional ethics class was held in a small, dimly lit room that felt more like an interrogation chamber. Claire sat at a desk, facing the instructor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with a quiet but firm voice. "Welcome, Claire," the instructor began. "Here, we'll teach you how to separate the personal from the professional. It's not easy, but for some, it's the only chance they get." Claire felt her pride hit rock bottom again, but she clenched her jaw and forced herself to endure it. Jacob Randolph, too, was feeling the heat. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting, demanding answers. "You let this situation spiral out of control," one board member stated. "This incident has damaged the company's reputation." "I'm handling it," Jacob replied, his voice calm, though his insides churned. He knew that incidents like this could cost the company millions. When Claire left the office, her steps felt heavy, as if she were carrying more than just the weight of her actions. In the hallway, she could feel every glance from her colleagues, silent but filled with judgment. They avoided her, refused to meet her eyes, and that was worse than anything they could have said. She knew they had all seen her pride crumble in an instant, leaving her with nothing to hide. As she stepped outside, the cold wind struck her face, a stark reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. How one mistake had the power to alter her life so drastically. Jacob's words echoed in her mind, their icy tone, his unyielding disappointment, now mirrored by her own. In that moment, Claire realized that everything she had once thought of as her right, her confidence, her fight for what she believed was right, meant nothing without respect for others. In defending her ideals, she had lost not only her career, but also the respect of the people she once called her colleagues. She couldn't shake the thought of how something as small as a hat had cost her so much. Everything she had built, every conviction she had held, and every moment she had felt self-assured and justified, gone, vanished like smoke, leaving her with emptiness and the understanding that pride and principles can become destructive if they lack context, respect, and consideration for others' values. But she also knew this wasn't the end. Perhaps it was the beginning of a new path, a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. Maybe she needed to learn humility, to understand that being right isn't always what matters most, even when acting with good intentions. And that lesson, painful as it was, would prove to be the most important one of all.